Hello, I'm Jenna Arndt.
And I'm Sarah Conlon, and we are both transition specialists with Loudoun County Public Schools. We want to welcome you to the Career Planning from Strengths-Based Approach module.
This is the second professional development activity this year in collaboration and partnership with the Center on Transition Innovations through VCU. We are working closely with them to build capacity within our division on effective middle school career development practices for students with intensive support needs.
The last presentation, Charting the Course, Navigating Career Development in Middle School, highlighted the importance of laying a foundation for successful employment outcomes for our students and the need for our vision to align with employment-first practices and utilize a strengths-based approach.
This self-paced module will focus on discovering student strengths and utilizing them to develop students' career goals.
We ask that you take this information, reflect on your current practices, and identify the strengths needed to better support Loudoun County Public School students and families with critical transition engagement in middle school. The information will be invaluable as we begin talking about employment and work experiences within CII and school-based enterprises.
We hope you find this module by the Center on Transition Innovations informative and helpful as they dive into career planning from a strengths-based approach.
Before we get started today, we want to go over the objectives so that we're all on the same page. Number one, by the end of this presentation, we'll want you to be able to define a strength-based approach and the benefits of such an approach. We'll also be looking at identifying data sources at particular transition points where you can find that data and how that might be used. And then finally, we'd like for you to be able to articulate how to develop a career-based plan that's based on a student's strengths and interests, utilizing that data that we'll talk about. So let's look at the career planning process and the 4 steps that we'll be talking about today. We look at one that's more cylindrical, circular than linear, because we really will be coming back around several times through that career planning process as we move the student towards their end goal and exiting school and moving on to their chosen career. The first step is looking at defining and discovering those strengths. So we'll start there. What are those strengths? And then how can we build on that? The next thing we'll look at is assessing those strengths, really looking at how might they be used? What information do we need in order to move through the career planning process? Do we need aptitude information? Do we need just more refined information on that particular strength before we move on? Step 3 will be exploring, because we want them to be able to go out and really get some hands-on experience looking at how do I really like what we're talking about? I've got this strength, but I'm not sure that I want to do that all the time. Maybe that's not a career that I want to do all the time. So we'll be exploring. And then finally, it'll be looking at action. What sort of goal can we put in place that will help the student continue moving towards that career through the career planning process? I'll give you an example. Let's say you're working with a student who's really interested in computers. We're not really sure if they have the aptitude, and we need to sort of refine that interest. So we've discovered a strength because they say they're interested, they spend a lot of time on their iPad, they like to code, but let's see what else that might look like. So then we're going to do an assessment. In this student's particular case, we take them to 2 different environments where they might be able to work with computers. One is at an Apple store, not an iPad store, but an Apple store where they have to work with customers. They're also working with technology and computers, but there's also a customer service aspect to that environment. And then we also have them explore a little bit or do some situational assessments in a computer company, an IT company, where there's not as much interaction with the public. At the end of that experience and that situational assessment in 2 different environments, the student comes back and says, actually, I really preferred the environment that didn't include as much customer service. My interest is in the technology aspect of it, and I'd rather not have the customer service aspect to the environment, the work environment. So then we move on to exploration, and we have the student experience a longer exploration in a different IT company where we can gather some long-term data on their aptitude through several different situations, work situations. That also gives us some really good information and the students some really good information on the environment that they prefer, an environment that they like, the task that they do well with in that work environment. At the end of that longer exploration, the student decides that they'd like to take action. Their next step is to set a goal and an action step to take a computer course at the local community college so that they can continue to build their skill. And then that cycle starts all over again. What are those strengths that we discover through the course? How can we put that into, how can we assess that? How can he explore that further and then taking additional action? It's that constant circular process. So what is a strength-based approach? Well, a strength-based approach is really looking at what is the person the best at? What are they good at? What are they interested in? And what sort of contributions can they make? It's not all based on unicorns and rainbows. We'll certainly be looking at a student's challenges and conditions for success and honoring those, but we're not going to build on their challenges. We're going to build and focus on the person's positive traits and attributes. What are those things that allow them to make contributions in their home, in their community? And also, what are the things that they enjoy and that they like to do and would want to spend time doing? It's also very person-centered. A strength-based approach really looks at the whole person. As I've said before, it's not ignoring or dismissing those things that are challenges or conditions for success for the person. It's honoring those while also building on their strengths. What do they like? For example, I'm not an accountant. That's not one of my strengths. So I've gone into a field where I feel like I have some strengths and can make some contributions. It's that person-centered approach. What do they want? And they are the center of those decisions. It's also used across disciplines. While this strength-based approach first grew out of social work, it's used in the medical field, in psychology, in substance abuse and mental health, really looking at what are those person's strengths and how can we build on them? Because we recognize that if we can build on strengths, we're going to have a lot more chance of success in the future. And then finally, it really complies with both the letter and the spirit of transition. We know that when we're looking at IEPs through Indicator 13, one of the things that we're tasked with looking at is what is the student's voice? How do we see the student voice through this process? And really that's looking at listening to the student, going back to that person-centered planning process, listening to the student and just really building something that's based on their interests so that it complies with the letter and the spirit. We really want students to be sharing that information with us and then us helping them to move in the direction, that circular process of moving towards their successful outcomes. Now we get to data. Why data? What's the importance of data? Well, first, it alleviates assumption risk. And I have a very short story here. I was working with a student several years ago who said that they really wanted to work in restaurant careers. They had the opportunity to experience short-term situational assessment in 3 vocational areas at the local technical center. He was not given that opportunity. And his planning team made the assumption that he needed to be in masonry. He was a big strapping boy. Masonry seemed like it would be a good fit for him, but they assumed where they thought he would do well. They thought he would make more money working in masonry and that would just be a better fit for him. He didn't, as you can imagine, he didn't do all that well in the masonry program because he didn't want to be there. People had made an assumption rather than looking at the opportunity for him to experience that situational assessment or the data could have given them that information. It's also completely impartial and unbiased. When you've got the data on the sheet, that's one of the ways that you can help the student to understand both, here's how your strength led you to have really good assessment data, or sometimes it's a matter of, sometimes those challenges or those conditions for success, maybe we didn't plan for that and we need to honor that. And the assessment data helps you to understand what are those conditions for success and how might we be able to assist the student in moving towards their goals. It paints that picture of here's what the student does well with, and here are where their challenges are, so that we can continue in that circular process of moving the student towards their post-school goals. It'll help you to figure out what the next steps are, because it'll tell you what more data do we need. Do we need to have more information on the student's aptitude in certain areas? Do we not have enough information on really their ability to engage in that particular work environment? Where do we need to go next? And that's what the data will indicate. We also don't want you working harder. We want you to be able to look at what is the information that you already have and really glean that out to find the student's strengths. It is part of what's already happening with the student as they go through their school day. So what do you know? What do you want to know? And what questions do you need to ask in order to lead you to those answers? That's really all data is. So let's get started with looking at, as the student moves through their school processes and their school experiences, where can we find those strengths and where can we pull that data? First, let's start with previous school experiences and previous student experiences. Everybody has a past, everybody's come from somewhere. Even if you're working with students who are little itty bitty kids, they all have some information that comes from their past. What is that information? Where can you find it? And how can you share that and start to look at their strengths based on the information that you already have at your fingertips? Did the student have previous work study experiences? Any situational assessments? Maybe they were working in school jobs or volunteer opportunities or civic or recreational opportunities, such as church youth groups, church youth groups or civic experiences. Maybe they volunteered with Rotary or they were involved with T-ball. That'll give you some really great information. So what kind of data can you pull from here? Well, certainly formal assessments, that triennial evaluation or initial evaluation for a particular student, you're going to be able to glean a lot of really good information from those. Any school-based records, teachers' notes, classroom jobs and observations, anything where they're really getting an opportunity to have hands-on experience, that data, maybe it's an observation from one of those experiences that's going to give you some good information. But also informal assessments, interest inventories, paper, pencil, maybe they did it on the computer, any of those sorts of situations that are going to give you that really good data. But we also don't want to ignore the family. The family sees the student oftentimes in a very different light than the school does. What sort of family surveys could you offer for the family to participate in, to give you more information? Or what are their experiences? It could be checklists or interviews, and it shouldn't be limited just to the people who live in that student's house. We certainly want to know more also from extended family members that might spend a lot of time with that student, grandparents or aunts or uncles or siblings. We also want to start moving out of our silos, which you briefly saw a picture of a silo. You want to start moving out of those silos. So often when we're working with students, especially I know from being in the classroom, I had a very narrow view of the student. It was just during those, sometimes 45 to 90-minute blocks, depending on when I had them during the day, that was who I saw. And it may be that they didn't particularly connect with, maybe that they didn't connect with me, or maybe they didn't connect with the particular subject matter I was teaching. So my view of them was very narrow. But when I talked to others, oftentimes I found out that they had a very different experience with that particular student that could lead us to finding out more strengths. So we really want to get out of our silos because there are so many strengths that students exhibit throughout different environments. In unstructured settings, gosh, we all know that that gives us a lot of information about a particular student. Situations, between classes, before school, after school, lunch times. And those can just be really informal notes that you might take, that you might want to share with the case manager. Or if you're the case manager, just letting others know, I really want to know what that student looks like in different environments. Can you help me out? Also at work, and Eliza will really touch on how to collect that data and look for strengths through work experiences. The bottom line, though, is that we just really want to be able to know who the whole student is, not just the part that one or two of us might experience. So looking at who they are in unstructured environments and also those more structured environments. And how can we collect that data? What does that data look like? We've talked about all of that extensive previous data that you'd want to look at, but also the relationship building piece, the points of connection. Some people might, we said before, some people might connect with that particular student better than others. What are their experiences with the student? But oftentimes, disciplines also, an academic discipline might make a difference as far for that particular student. Perhaps they're much better in one subject than they are in others. And so they look a lot different and they display strengths in that particular subject matter that we don't have an opportunity to see with the subject matter that we're teaching. We also don't want to do just formal situations, but look at that anecdotal and the informal, and then establishing that baseline data. And Eliza will discuss more as far as that's concerned, that's really within the workplace with baseline data.
All right, so thank you, Kendall, for that nice transition and overview of what data collection can look like in schools and how important it is to be collecting this information on students. We're going to talk about now what that can look like at work. And also remember the definition that Kendall gave about a strengths-based approach. This really fuels how to collect data in a work-based setting. So from the very first day, it's important to start with your students' strengths. What do they do well? And what this translates to is it gives students independence and self-awareness, confidence and advocacy. They're able to see that they do have strengths and what areas those can grow in. So that discovery and exploration about what they like to do and what they're good at. When students begin to understand their abilities, their conditions for success, their interests, they're able to make better informed choices about preparation for their chosen career area. I like to think of looking at strengths at work from the very first day as step aside and look what I can do. It's an authentic way to see students from the very beginning what they can do independently. And when you start from this, you're already starting at the space to think of what other challenging tasks can I introduce? So again, you're just raising your expectations of your students and creating more opportunities. Authentic assessment. Let's start with what that means. It's a performance assessment. So teachers ask students to provide evidence or they observe performance that they have gotten it, that they understand what they're doing. They show that they can do the work. And why we use this at work is it really is this idea of learning by doing. It is, I've mentioned in the last slide, and it says in the title, it is the most authentic way you can see how a student is performing. And it's viewed as best practice for students with significant disabilities because it focuses on the generalization of real life skills and behaviors in natural environments. So students are They are learning by doing. They're showing you what they can do, and they're communicating in ways that other assessments might not give them the opportunity to communicate in. And it gives students the opportunity to show their knowledge. They might have not been able to demonstrate that through a more traditional route. So if authentic assessments are created correctly, you're able to gain observations and information and data on academic and practical skills. So data, what is a task analysis? Before, Kendall mentioned this idea of baseline data, and that is actually just from that first day, what you can observe without any intervention, without you coming in and providing correction or reteaching. You're just watching the student. And I have to say, through job coaching, this is really a challenging part, and you might have experienced this through teaching as well, of actually just letting your student do something with the potential that they can fail. And this is giving them that space to do that. So in a task analysis, you're not providing any support, you're just observing. And it's really useful to identify whether a student is making progress, acquiring skills, where additional instruction is required. This way, you're not wasting time teaching a step that a student already knows how to do. And you can focus on the needs that the student has. When you collect information at the beginning of the task, you have an idea of where the student is starting out. For example, let's say a student is starting out in data entry, and you want to see how a student is doing. So you write down everything you notice that the student is doing, and all of this information, that's your baseline data. Then you know your student works, in what area and without any type of intervention. And as time goes on, you can see the student gets more independent in their work, and you notice changes. Write down this information, take notes, that is your data. So this is a way for you to encourage independence in your student, and you can take this information over time, and that is you measuring progress. A task analysis is a breakdown of the task step by step by step. Let's see an example of that. So when you break it down, the first thing you need to do is select the task that you're going to break down, and then you complete the task yourself. And the reason why you do this is because when you're thinking of a task, maybe something simple like making a sandwich, you think, okay, I've got a couple of things, put it together, I have a sandwich. But when you start writing down every single step it takes to make a sandwich, you realize, oh my goodness, there's a lot that goes into this. So it takes your bias out of it and helps you see the task in every single piece of it. Then you ask yourself, is there any teaching that you need to do to build on this knowledge? So does the student already have some of this information, some of this awareness, or is there any teaching that you're going to have to do to support them? And then when you're making all of these steps, you want to make sure that the steps are observable, so you can actually see what the student is doing. The problem solving wouldn't be a step in the task analysis, but making the decision of this or this, that is observable. And then you test it out yourself. So let's do an example of this. Okay, so checking your email. That is going to be the task that I select. Completing the task myself. So I did this earlier and I was like, okay, I get my computer, open it, log on to email. So that was 3 steps. But then when I broke it down, I was like, okay, the first thing I have to do is locate my computer. The second thing I have to do is power on the computer. The third is type in my password. The fourth is find the browser. Fifth would be open up the browser. Sixth, you go to your email. So maybe that's Gmail and that's already connected to your browser when you open up your home screen, or maybe it's not. So decide, that might be a couple steps in there. And then actually checking your email. Everyone has a little bit of a different process in that, but maybe you go through the most recent emails or all of your unread emails. Okay, so that was 9 or 10 steps. You can see how difficult tasks are. And when you're thinking of a student, maybe the student locates their computer without any prompting. They open it up, they power it on, but they don't remember their password. So that is where you would decide, okay, that's where I need to provide some support. Is there something on their phone that they can use to keep their passwords? Or is there a piece of paper they can have to keep their passwords? So that is showing that you break down all these steps, you see where the student needs that additional support. So maybe it wasn't until step 3, but then over time you see, okay, they don't need any support remembering their password anymore. So when you collect this data, it's taking that, writing it down, and then you can communicate that with other people like parents and families. Let's talk about goal setting. So goals are directly translatable to career development. Take all the observations and you can share them with an employer. You can share them with parents and guardians. You can share them during IEP meetings. The goal setting process needs to be all around a student and it helps them work towards that goal. So the way you can use this goal setting too to have that communication and conversation with an employer, maybe you were working with an employer and they were hesitant about hiring a student with a disability, especially a younger student with a disability. They don't have any work experience yet. The employer is hesitant because maybe they have their own biases of disability. You can take these goals that the student has set for themselves, communicate that and say, okay, my student is able to complete this task in 10 minutes. What's the average time for any employee to complete this task? I can guarantee it's pretty close to 10 minutes. So that shows that the student is at that same level and can perform these tasks. It's an opportunity to brag about your student. So definitely utilize that and teach your students how to do that for themselves, have some advocacy for themselves. When you share this information with families, it helps raise expectations of the student's skills at home, and it builds that communication between you and the family. So maybe there's something that a student is doing at home that they're not doing at school or vice versa. Collecting data and sending that home and facilitating those conversations just helps raise those expectations and wraparound supports for that home, school, and community. It also holds students accountable. So how many of us have a bad day? That's very normal. When you track that information though for a student and share that with them, you can help them reflect on why their performance today was a little bit less than what they normally do and have a conversation around it. You can track it and see maybe it has to deal with coming to work on a Monday and maybe their speed is lower on that day, and you can share it with them and say, what's going on? And it has that conversation, just opens it for them. Maybe they're really not excited about the week. So you can then create some interventions for them to help them get pumped up to go to work. Let us look at data collection in a whole new light. I really enjoy self-evaluations. So self-evaluations are very useful to use with students. It's a learned skill. It Collecting your own data can be very motivating. If you're the one collecting the data, share it with your student, share that load with them. Sometimes a paycheck is too delayed for gratification, and the verbal praise gets old after a while. So having a student self-assess themselves and collect data is a way for them to keep progress of themselves. Ultimately, you want to have independence for the student on a job site. So creating this opportunity and having the student collect their data, it is a win-win. It alleviates that burden from you from doing that, and it gives them the opportunity to enhance independence. And also it gives you the opportunity to support a different student. So an example that you can see on the screen is when I was working with a student at a child development center, and every single day she would go, how'd I do? How'd I do? How'd I do? After every single task. And at first I was like, oh, you did great. You did great. This is what you need to work on. But I was realizing she can be assessing herself and she can be doing this herself. So we broke down the tasks, and here are just some examples of them. And I had her rank from 1 to 5 how well she did. So at first, she said, okay, greeting the parents. I remembered most of the names, almost all the names. So that's what she wrote down. Passing out breakfast, she gave herself at first a 5. She was like, I did great at this. And after reflecting on it, she wrote down, I forgot to do a table. And I said, okay, so is that a 5, or would that be something kind of more towards a 1 or a 2? And she said, that's definitely a 2. I can improve on that. So it gave us time to communicate with each other about expectations at work. It also gave her that skill for critical self-reflection, which is so important in a workplace. Students should be evaluating and assessing themselves. They're not always going to have a teacher there to tell them what they need to improve on. They need to be learning these skills. And you might also be thinking, I don't have a student that could rank themselves 1 to 5 and write a sentence about how they did. That's completely fine. You don't need to use this exact way to collect data. You can use emojis. I found that really helpful with students before too. They can select from different emojis how they did on tasks, or maybe they can use assistive technology and take voice memos after each task and then listen to them at the end of the day. There's really so many ways to do self-evaluation, but I just wanted to show you one example that I had with a student. And I'm gonna be switching it back over to Kendall to share a little bit more about preparing for transitions.
Thanks, Eliza. That was some really great information. I especially like the piece about the self-evaluations. Thank you very much. The next part we want to talk about, though, is a little bit about preparing for transitions, whether that's a transition between schools or grades, or even possibly a student exiting school services and going into the real world. We want to be able to communicate at this place. What we want to do is be able to communicate what the student's strengths, interests, and contributions are to those people who will be supporting them next or working with them next. This could be for students who are in school services and graduating, potential employers. How can the student and potential employee, how can they share their strengths with that employer or employers if they're job searching? Could it be through some sort of, obviously a resume is a great place to share your strengths, and for some students that might be a video resume. So just looking at how can, once again, looking at the data, how can we put that into a place where they can share it with others while also honoring their challenges and their conditions for success. So we want to continue doing that during this transition time. You might want to figure out, how can I share this information with DARS? What's the best way for me to share this information with DARS, which is the employer support that they might receive both during school and following school services. that adult agency that helps with employment. What's the best way to be able to share their strengths with their case manager with DARS? They definitely want that information. Community services boards that may be supporting students with more significant disabilities, or other service providers who might help them as they move towards adult independence. And then you want to look at packaging those strengths so that you can share that data in a nice, comfortable way for the person to be able to take that information in, whether that's a portfolio or a resume, or what I talked about earlier or briefly mentioned, the video resume. And things, just keep in mind that it doesn't have to look like it's always looked before. What might that data be that you want to share with a potential employer or a certain adult service agency? Certainly employer evaluations, any employer evaluations, whether paid or unpaid work that they may have had through their school experiences. Goal acquisition, students that you've worked with who have been involved with I'm Determined. Goal acquisition, goal setting and acquisition is a big part of that process. Any self-evaluations from work that they particularly want to share. Maybe they want to share one, here's what my self-evaluations looked like at the beginning of my work experience, but this is what they look like at the end of that experience, where you can really be able to show the growth that the student had during that period. Any coursework documentation, is there coursework that relates to their post-school goal for employment? You're going to want to include that, certainly. And then certifications or credentials that will make them a more valuable prospective employee when the employer is reviewing their data.
Kendall, I wanted to add one more thing here as well.
Oh, great.
Yeah, because something that I think about is the idea of, can data collection still happen in this virtual world? And I wanted to say that it really can. I do a lot of job coaching with students virtually and have been able to successfully do task analyses and also self-evaluation and other data collection techniques. I've done it virtually. So I just wanted to say that though data collection might look and feel a little bit different, it actually really can happen virtually. So definitely keep that in mind when you're thinking of, setting goals for yourself, for students, and other areas like this where you can continue to build this portfolio.
Oh, thanks, Eliza. That's valuable information, because that's that sort of, and I know you're far more versed than I am with that, with working with some of the students you're working with this fall. So I appreciate you sharing that. Yes, continue that. Also the job coaching, but that's another topic, right? In a virtual world. Now we've come to the conclusion of our presentation today on a strengths-based approach to career planning. Thank you for joining us. We certainly appreciate you being here and sharing in our time together. If you have any questions, we are Eliza and Kendall, and our contact information is down at the bottom of the screen. Please, if you have questions, don't hesitate to contact us. Thanks again. Have a great day.